Casey Anthony's trial happened in 2011. However, right now there's a lot of renewed interest in Casey Anthony's trial. A lot of the reason is that there's a documentary that recently came out. People watched it and they're curious about what happened in 2011. A lot of people were younger. They weren't so much into true crime at that point. So we actually did not even have our channel back in 2011. So I thought it was a great opportunity to live stream every single day of Casey Anthony's trial. We had day 1 today, and you should definitely join us for the continuation of day 2 and day 3, hopefully tomorrow. So we're going to be doing that tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern. So join us right back here, October 21st, where we're going to be continuing to live stream Casey Anthony's trial. And if you can't catch the live stream, well, you can catch the recap videos that we are going to be also doing, hopefully, after each day of trial to recap everything that happened and give you my analysis and my takeaways as a lawyer watching the trial and what stood out to me. So without any further ado, let's jump into day 1. The opening statement by the prosecutor started off with laying out all the different lies that Casey Anthony told when Kaylee Anthony, which is her daughter, who was murdered in this case or died in this case. We're going to see soon the different theories in this case. But according to the prosecution, Casey murdered her and then tried to hide it by pretending and making up all these lies. So she laid out all the different lies that she was saying. She definitely said a number of lies. Then eventually it gets to July 15th, 2008. July 15th, 2008, that is when a letter was placed at her parents' house where she actually also stayed. Now, at the time when this is going on, she's actually not staying by her parents' house. She moved in with her boyfriends, which we're going to get to a little bit later. But for most of her life, she stayed and lived with her parents. So this letter arrives on the door of George and Cindy Anthony. That is Casey Anthony's parents. And the letter was letting them know that there was something at the post office that they need to come pick up. They went to the post office to retrieve the letter from Johnson Wrecker Company. So it's a tow truck company, essentially, which towed the vehicle that actually Casey Anthony was driving at the time. She was really the one who was driving this car, but it was towed to this Wrecker Company, their lot. And since George was the registered owner of that vehicle, that's why he got this notice from the Wrecker Company. So he gets this letter, got to go pick up the car, and it's a white Pontiac Sunfire titled in George Anthony's name, and he goes with a fellow named Simon Birch to retrieve the car. Well, George starts telling Birch about the problems that they're having not being able to see their granddaughter. George is missing her granddaughter. He hasn't seen her in a month. Remember, this is July 15th. According to the prosecution, she went missing June 16th. So this is already a month after she's been gone. They want to see her granddaughter. And for whatever reason, which the defense is going to highlight also, George decides to tell this person at the Wrecker Company about his desire to see his granddaughter and that he hasn't able to see her and wasn't actually not able even to see Casey Anthony in the past month. She was also making up excuses why she was not able to come back to the Anthony household. Well, as they get to the car, an overwhelming stench comes from the trunk of the car, and Simon Birch is going to tell you what his experience of what that smell was, and you can imagine at this point the smell of human remains. So the trunk is opened, and there is a garbage bag inside the trunk. What do they do with the garbage bag? They don't open up the garbage bag. Actually, what he does is he takes the garbage bag and he tosses it in the dumpster. Don't worry, that garbage bag was later recovered, but there was no human remains really in that garbage bag. We're going to see a little bit more later about what they did find in the trunk of the car. But right now we're dealing with the smell that Simon Birch is going to identify what that smell was, which he believes is human remains. So George drove the car home. And when he brings the car home, and Cindy, his wife, remember Casey's mother, Cindy, so she sees the car and she smells the car and she says, sheesh, Jesus, what died in that car? Now, it has been at the tow yard since June 30th. So it's been in the tow yard for a while. And therefore, if there was some human remains in there that was decomposing, it would really stink. Now, we're going to see later that actually there was really no human remains that were found in the trunk, except maybe perhaps one. We're going to see about that later, but it still stunk from human remains. So they put the car in the garage to air it out. And at some point, Cindy starts talking to her coworker. Cindy's working at the time. So she starts talking to her coworker about what's going on. And the coworker convinces her that she has to call the police. Now, what Cindy does is that she texts Casey, her daughter, first. And she says, there's a major problem. We need to talk. First of all, her problem is that she didn't see her granddaughter or her daughter in a month. So she really wants to see her. So Casey's being evasive. She's lying. And she's saying, I need to see you. Cindy is saying, I need to see you, Casey. Well, Casey was actually with a friend named Amy. And Amy was somebody who actually was, information was left in the trunk of that white Pontiac Sunfire, which is now sitting at the Anthony home, Cindy's home. So she's actually able to locate Amy by looking into the trunk and seeing this number for an Amy, who is Casey's friend. Now, what then happens is that she is, at that point, she is actually at her boyfriend's house. Casey is at her boyfriend's house, Anthony, and that's, believe it or not, that's his first name. So even though the last name here is Casey Anthony, but Casey Anthony's boyfriend at the time was Anthony. And some call him Tony. Maybe we should call him Tony just for make things a little bit simple. So she's at her boyfriend's apartment, and that is where Amy, her friend, dropped her off. So when Cindy contacts Amy and says, hey, look, this has gone on long enough. I need to speak to my daughter, Casey. I need to find her. What's the story with her? Do you know what's going on with her? Well, Amy goes and so Amy meets up with Cindy at some point, and Cindy picks up Amy. Amy gets into the car and tells her where to find Casey in Tony Lazzaro's apartment, her boyfriend. So they go to the apartment, and of course, Kaylee is not there. Kaylee's the daughter, remember. Kaylee's the daughter, Casey's the mother, Casey Anthony, and Casey's mother is Cindy. Try to keep these names in mind. So they eventually, Cindy gets to the apartment. She speaks to Casey, convinces Casey to come with her back in the car. They get back in the car, and Amy's also there. So they first drop off Amy, and then they eventually make their way back to where Cindy lives, the Anthony home. But first, they stop off at the Orlando Police Department. But the Orlando Police Department was closed. It was already at night, so it was closed at the time. So what do they do? So Cindy calls 911. She calls 911 from the parking lot from the Orlando Police Department. And Cindy wants her daughter arrested. So right away, this should stick out at you as a little bit interesting. You have the mother here, the mother of Casey Anthony, who's calling the police saying that Casey should be arrested. Okay, usually mothers kind of stick up for their daughters, but there's obviously some other issues here. So Cindy is talking to 911, and this is from the Orlando, talking to the Orlando Police Department. And the Orlando Police Department, after figuring out where Cindy lives, says, you know, this is really out of our jurisdiction. The jurisdiction where it really should tackle this case or take on this case is the Orange County Sheriff. So they're the ones that have jurisdiction. Go back home, call the Orange County Sheriff. So she does call the police again once they reach back at the Anthony home. So Cindy calls the police again, and you hear Cindy threatening to take Kaylee away from Casey because she hasn't seen her in a month. What's going on with her? We don't know where she is. You're lying to us, and it's her granddaughter. So you can hear her threatening to take Kaylee away from Casey. Then George Anthony, George is Cindy's husband, Casey's father. Now George calls the brother, Lee Anthony, and tells him to come over to the house where they live on Spring Drive. So he gets there, and he's there with Cindy and Casey there. And again, there is this overpowering smell from the garage. And what they decide to do, the parents, is because Casey's not being forthcoming about what's going on with Kaylee, where is she, what's the story with her, they tell Lee, the brother, that maybe you could talk to Casey and get this information out of Casey. So Lee, Casey's brother, is trying to talk to Casey and trying to talk sense into her. Why don't you just tell us where Kaylee is? What's going to happen is the police are going to come here. They're going to go through all this anyway with you. So why don't you just tell us where Kaylee is, and we can go and see Kaylee. Cindy makes another call to 911, and this time it goes to the Orange County Sheriff, as we spoke about. And again, talking about having her daughter possibly arrested, and also telling them about a possible missing 3-year-old girl. So the police are dispatched to the address, and they're actually, according to the prosecution, not really 100% sure why they're going over. Not exactly sure the gravity of the situation. So not sure if they're going over for a domestic issue. Maybe Casey's trying to hide Kaylee from the parents or whatever it is. So they're not exactly sure why they're going over there, but they're going over because there's this phone call and potentially a missing 3-year-old. So what happens is that when they are talking to Casey and when she's pushed into a corner, according to the prosecution, she comes up with a lie, another lie, a different type of lie. And this time she says that actually Kaylee was kidnapped. She was kidnapped by the nanny, her babysitter, whose name is Zenaida Fernando Gonzalez, who they also called Zany. So this is what Casey's story is to the police, and telling Cindy and George and Lee what really happened is that her daughter was actually kidnapped by her nanny. Cindy calls the police again. This is the third time. And then she eventually gets Casey to get on the phone, and Casey was being very evasive with the police. Why do you want to talk to me? And we're going to hear all about that as they play the 911 phone call. So as the police are talking to Casey, and they're there and they're talking to Cindy, and they're figuring out, well, who is this Zenaida person? Let's go, or Zenaida, I may be mentioning her name wrong and I'm pronouncing her name wrong. Apologize. Anyway, so who is this Zenaida? Well, she lives in the Sawgrass apartment building, and Casey goes and shows them where the last time she saw her own daughter Kaylee was, by this Sawgrass apartment building. And that's what she claims Zenaida lives. So the problem is that when they actually look into the apartment, or look into the records of the apartment that Casey led them to, no one was living there since February. Now remember, this is July 2008. She claims that the last time that she saw her daughter Kaylee was June 2008, when she dropped her off at this Zenaida's apartment, and really no one's lived there since February. So then they eventually go to Tony Lazara's apartment, and that's where they get her cell phone. Actually, I think Lee goes there. She gets her cell phone, gets other belongings. The police also actually went to the apartment, and they get there was 2 different trips. Lee went there, and as well as the police went there to get her cell phone and other belongings, because she said, after all, she had a contact for Zenaida in her phone. And then she writes out a statement. And this is another very interesting part of this case. And again, I'm very new to this case. I'm watching this for the first time right now, but this is the questions that jump out at me. She writes a statement out to the police, a 4-page statement. And the prosecution says it's 4 pages of lies. Now, what's interesting to me is that she actually wrote 4 pages of lies. Sometimes when someone wants to tell a lie, they want to say it quickly and not say so many different details and facts about what they're lying about. They want to keep it very, very evasive and very ambiguous and not go on and on and on. But this is what the prosecution says happened. She wrote out a statement of 4 pages, which were all lies, all about the nanny kidnapping Kaylee. So a detective eventually comes to the house. Another detective comes to the house. There's a lot of detectives that are involved in this case. So another detective comes to the house and is talking to Casey about what's going on. And the detective says, is this really just all about a domestic situation? You just don't want your parents involved with your child's life anymore? Just like, what's really going on here? And I don't know the rest of that conversation, but they had some sort of conversation about that. And it seems that no, she's sticking to her story that this was actually kidnapping by the nanny. So on July 16th now, which is the next day, this all started on July 15th, July 16th, the next day, the detectives arrive at more detectives arrive at the Anthony house, and they record a conversation that they have with Casey. And again, asks her, is there anything that you want to change about your statement, your 4-page statement? Is there anything you want to change about it? And she says, no, it's all the truth. And they were all lies. Now, she claims that she actually had another phone that was lost at Universal Studios. Now, what does Universal Studios have to do with it? Well, Casey claimed that she worked at Universal Studios at the time. And that she told employees that she worked with at Universal Studios what happened to Kaylee. So this is a very interesting piece of information for the detectives. So another part of the investigation actually is that they go to Zenaida's mother's apartment, which also didn't turn out to be the mother's apartment. And eventually they go to Universal Studios because this is where Casey said that she worked. So the detective goes to Universal Studios and contacts this person, Leonard Tutaro. And Leonard actually does work at Universal Studios. And they find out that Casey actually does not work at Universal Studios. And the people that she said are her coworkers that work at Universal Studios also do not work at Universal Studios. She hasn't worked there for years. So apparently at some point, maybe she did work there, but she hasn't worked there for years. So it doesn't matter because to Casey, she continues with the lie that she actually does work at Universal Studios. So they say, okay, well, why don't you take us into Universal Studios and show us where this other phone is? Well, they go to Universal Studios and she's denied access. What a surprise, because she doesn't actually work there. And she doesn't have an ID, but it's okay because Leonard is there and he gets them in anyway through his ID to get into Universal Studios. And they eventually get to administration building and she starts walking with purpose to a certain area in the administration office or administration building. And then at some point, all of a sudden abruptly turns around and says, actually, I don't work here. I don't really work here. So she comes clean. Then they show her pictures of Zenaida Gonzalez for all the Zenaida Gonzalez's that they have in their system, all their license pictures, and asks her, are any of these people the nanny that you're saying kidnapped your daughter? And she says, it's none of them. So at that point, she was arrested for lying to the police. So the crime that they got her on right now at this point was lying to the police. She's obviously lied to them that she doesn't work. She worked at Universal Studios. She doesn't really work there. So they arrest her for lying. Now, while this is all going on, there's a search. There's a countrywide search. All these different agencies are involved also in the search for Kaylee. Who is Kaylee? Where's Kaylee? Tips are pouring in about where Kaylee may have been sighted. And obviously everything turns out negative, that it really wasn't the Kaylee that they're looking for. Now, on July 16th, 2008, that is when the police seized the white Pontiac Sunfire. So we're going to have crime scene techs go all over that trunk and try to figure out what is going on with that trunk. The trash bag was eventually located in the dumpster that was tossed and the junkyard. And they had a cadaver dog go around the car. And we're going to hear testimony, apparently, in this case, from the dog's trainer, or the dog, this is a canine, this is a trained dog, that he knows when the dog is making signs or symptoms or signs and barks or whatever it is, that there is an odor of human remains. And this dog did alert his trainer or the police officer who works with him of the odor of human remains, which the dog identified. They also went to the yard at Cindy and George's home in the backyard near Kaylee's playhouse. The canine also alerted them of human remains. And then they brought in a second cadaver dog just to confirm, because maybe the first cadaver dog just had a bad day. So they brought in a second cadaver dog, and that dog also alerted Kaylee about Kaylee's playhouse, alerted the police of the odor of human remains. Well, they dug up that area and they did not find any human remains. So isn't that interesting also? But maybe the body was there at some point and that's what it picked up the scent. So they took apart all of the carpet lining from the trunk. They took apart the spare tire cover, Kaylee's DNA, and they found some hair that is attributed to Kaylee there. A single piece of hair. And they're able to attribute that hair to Kaylee in the trunk. And this hair, they're going to have experts testify, had decomposing effects on the hair. So hair looks a certain way when it is decomposing or decomposed. And that is what they're going to show with the evidence, that hair was actually on a body that was decomposing, suggesting that Kaylee's body was in the trunk of that Casey's car while it was decomposing. Then they talk about Dr. Voss. Dr. Voss is a leading expert in odor of human remains, and he was also able to determine, using his system and his expertise, that there's also the identification of human decomposition in the trunk of that car. Now, they also found some very interesting things. And they found chloroform, which they found a very high amount of chloroform, thousands of times greater than you would expect to find in a regular human decomposition alone. So what is all this chloroform, which is a poison, what is all that doing in the trunk of a car? They also seized a desktop computer from the Anthony home. And on that desktop computer, which they identified certain dates and times where George and Cindy were out of the house. So there's only one other possibility, Casey. And they found some very concerning searches on that desktop computer. For example, they found chloroform, they found alcohol, they found self-defense, neck breaking, shovel, also Wikipedia searches for inhalation of chloroform, acetone, death, making weapons out of household items. So very concerning searches that they found on the desktop computer, which they attribute to Casey doing them because George and Lee, at the time that those searches were done, were at work. So on September, now this is all going on in July, August, as the investigation is going on. And in September of 2008, so this is already a number of months. The disappearance was in June. So it's July, August, September. There's still the search for Kaylee is still going on, even though they think that it's going that she was murdered or she's dead. Well, then December 11th, they get a very big break in the case, and that is that a tiny skull was located in the woods, a walking distance from Kaylee's home. So December 11th, that is when they were able, somebody, which we're going to hear about later in the defense's opening, located this tiny skull, and they found Kaylee's body wrapped in Winnie the Pooh blanket, stuffed into garbage bags and a laundry bag, and thrown into this littered swamp. All that remained was her clothing and the skeleton. She spent many months in that state. Now, there were 3 pieces of duct tape that were located covering her nose and her mouth. This is Kaylee's nose and mouth, and it was also stuck to her hair. So it was wrapped around with a very obvious intention of what the person who wrapped them around was trying to do. So, and also they were able to test and figure out that the duct tape was placed onto Kaylee's body prior to her decomposition. And this was a very odd type of duct tape. This wasn't your random standard duct tape. It was a very specific brand. It was not widely available, but guess what? There was this type of brand in the Anthony home. It was located in the Anthony home that they had identical duct tape to what was found on Kaylee. Also interesting is that on a missing child poster, when they were looking for Kaylee, somebody put up with a missing child poster, using the same duct tape. There's no evidence of trauma to her bones. Also, the Winnie the Pooh blanket was missing from Kaylee's home, the Anthony home. And that was essentially the prosecution's opening statement showing, look, you got a liar here. She's lying every single day that Kaylee's missing. She's lying to the police. She makes up this whole 4-page lie, lying about Universal Studios. And then all of this other information, all this evidence linking Casey to the death of Kaylee, and also George and Cindy have alibis. They were out of the house during certain times and they had nothing to do with it and nothing to gain. Now, where's the motive? Where really is the motive? A lot of times, again, you don't have to prove motive, but you many times hear about motive. So the prosecution's idea of the motive was that Casey wanted to live the good life without being bogged down with Kaylee. Kaylee was her daughter, and she wasn't allowing Casey to live the life that she wanted to live. And that was the idea. That was how the prosecution finished its opening statement. Then the defense opened with their opening statement. And I just want to point something out to you, and I can't play all these clips for you because we don't have so much time in the recap videos, but hopefully we'll get to certain clips when it's not such a long day and all this stuff to unpack. But something very interesting happened that I want to point out in the defense's opening statement. You can go watch this from the beginning of the defense's opening statement and see what happens. What happened is that the defense attorney here is Jose Baez, who's a very, very respected and efficient and effective defense attorney. Okay, you can tell that from day one on this case. He really knows what he's doing. And I can tell you right away, this is my first trial that I'm watching with Jose Baez, and I'm impressed already from day one. Now, what all attorneys like to try to do, good attorneys that is that they're always trying to push the envelope. They're always trying to see what they can get away with. Opening statements, as we know, is a time for really, under the rules, you're just allowed to tell the jury what you expect the evidence to show, which is why we always hear from the prosecution and the defense attorneys, the evidence is going to show you this, the evidence is going to show you that. Well, you're not allowed, technically under the rules, to argue the case. That's what closing argument is for. That's what, after all the presentation of evidence, then you're able to argue your inferences and your theory of the case to the jury. But really, opening statement is really supposed to be limited to just letting the jury know what your evidence is going to show, what you expect the evidence to show. Again, all good attorneys try to push that line, and they try to argue their case in opening statements as well. So something that Ozzie Bias started doing in his opening statement was actually where he was already pushing that line and starting to try to argue his case. And the prosecutor in this case, made an objection. She stood up and she objected to Ozzie Bias' opening statement because she was arguing that what he's doing now is a closing argument. He's arguing the case. He's arguing the facts. That's not what you're allowed to do during opening statements. The judge overruled that specific objection. So it was one of the first times that Ozzie Bias is doing it. Again, there's some gray area here, right? There's always some gray area here. And the judge overruled the prosecutor's objection. Now, what you found after that, what I found so interesting after that, is that there was never another objection from the prosecution that Ozzie Bias was arguing his case in opening statements. And he was absolutely arguing his case. And in fact, he was emboldened by that ruling of the judge to continue to argue the case, which is, again, what good, effective attorneys do. If they see they're getting away with something, they're going to push harder until the judge stops them. I've heard from different attorneys, if the judge doesn't stop you, then you're not doing your job. You got to keep pushing the envelope as an advocate for your client. Okay, so this is what he was doing. And the prosecution, after that one objection that they made, all the way in the beginning of his opening statement, which was overruled, they became like a shrinking violet. They never objected again. And I think there was plenty of times, plenty of opportunity to object again. And I don't think this is something that I also see sometimes when lawyers will get overruled by a lawyer, by the judge, they'll kind of be more timid about their objections. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. You have a client to represent, or you're representing the state, you believe in your case and you believe someone's breaking the rules, object. If you get overruled, at least you made a record about it. So that was something I think after that you saw in the beginning of the opening statement, where that one objection was overruled, and then he went much further with his argument, and there was never another objection made. Okay, so that's just something you can rewatch and see how he used that to his advantage and pushed the ticket more and more and more and more, and the prosecution just kind of gave up after that one objection being overruled. Don't do that. Keep pushing, keep fighting for your client, keep fighting for your position. And if you get overruled, then you get overruled. At least you made a record. Okay, so, and I know people don't like to object a lot of times during opening statements, but if it's obvious, like we see in this case, if you watch the opening statement, there's a lot of argument in the opening statement. There's definitely room for a timely objection to be made again. All right, let's move on to the defense's opening statement. So he says, look, I'm going to tell you, seems for the first time, what actually happened in this case. Now, this is very interesting. A lot of times the defense attorneys do not do that. They don't say, I'm going to tell you what actually happened. We saw this in the Adelson trial, where Charlie Adelson's trial, if you remember that one, Dan Rashbaum got up and said, I'm going to tell you what actually happened. And it was created this double extortion theory. You don't always find it happening. And a lot of times defense attorneys don't like to do it because what they're kind of doing is that they're kind of taking on a burden. And the burden really is in the prosecution. The prosecution has the burden to prove this case. As the defense, you don't have any burden. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to call any witnesses. That's part of the jury instructions. But in this specific case, Ozzie Bias said, I'm going to tell you what happened. And what he said was that what happened was that actually on June 16th, 2008, Kaylee drowned in a pool. You know whose pool? The Anthony's pool. George and Cindy Anthony's pool, where Casey was living. June 16th was when that happened. So that's the first thing. That's the first hit. You hit your chair, hit the back of your chair when you're watching this. Like, wow, is that really what happened? How is he going to prove this? How is he going to lead up to this? And he did this very well. So he says that's actually what happened in this case. June 16, 2008. But why? Why would a woman wait 30 days before reporting her child? Why would Casey Anthony lie? And he agreed that she lied to the police. He's not going to fight back about that. He agreed that Casey lied to the police and lied to everybody involved. Why did she do that? Well, we're going to hear about that shortly. But first, he said, also to make this a little bit more palatable to the jury, he said that this is actually the number way that children die in Florida. It's the highest way, one of the highest ways apparently that children die in Florida through going swimming and drowning. So this is a common, unfortunate accident that happens in Florida all the time. And he says, I'm going to tell you why there's all these lies. And that is because this family, the Anthony family, is incredibly dysfunctional. And there's some very ugly and secretive things that they probably don't want ever to get out. And that's how they were raised. That's how Casey Anthony was raised. And that's why Kaylee, after Kaylee was died in the swimming accident by drowning, according to the defense, Casey just hid her pain. She hid and lied about it because that's how she was trained in the Anthony home, pretending nothing was wrong. Now, something is definitely not right with Casey, as the Jose Baez says. You are going to learn that there's a lot of problems that Casey has, and we're not going to fight you on that. There's a lot of problems with Casey. There's something that's not right with Casey, but she was an excellent mother. She never abused Kaylee. There's no records of that. There's no records of hospital visits. She was a good mother, and she would never hurt her child. But the family trained her and raised her to lie. You know why? Because her father abused her when she was a young child. He would come into her room and abuse her in a way that you can use your imagination for. So that is what he did. And when you're an 8-year-old daughter, when you're an 8-year-old girl, and then you have to go to school the next day, you learn how to lie about those things because that's not something that you want to start talking to people about. So she would always act like it never happened. So she did pretend that she had a nanny. She pretended that she had a job, and she never did. She did not have it. Well, she had some certain points she had a job, but she lied to the police about the job and lied about the nanny. And then also this very odd thing, and this is also something I just want to point out that I mentioned during the live stream, but anytime that you're the prosecutor, what you have to do is you have to be able to know the good idea about what the defense is going to bring up in their opening statements. And you have to bring it up yourself. You have to anticipate, and then you have to diffuse the arguments or the statements, whatever the defense is going to say in their opening statement. Anytime that you go first, you got to do that. And the prosecutor didn't do it in this case. Now, maybe she didn't know about the theory, which is very possible. She didn't know about the swimming theory, but she must have known about this abuse allegation. And if she didn't, well, then she should have been objecting all over the place during the opening statement. So something tells me that she actually knew about this. And again, I didn't see all the pre-trial motions and things that may have been brought up about this before. But that stuff, most likely, I would imagine, she knew about. And she could have diffused or could have brought up herself. And it's not pleasant, but it's going to definitely better for you to talk about it when it's you're able to spin it in your way than let the defense use it for all that it's worth. So another interesting thing that happened is that Casey was pregnant. And we're going to hear that the parents claim that they didn't really know it. George didn't really know, the father didn't really know that she was pregnant at all. And he showed a picture. There's a picture that they're going to see that you can very obviously tell that Casey was pregnant. And he's going to claim that he didn't know that she was pregnant at the time. And they're trying to hide it. So again, this pattern of hiding things in the Anthony family, that is how they're raised. That's in their DNA. That is the defense's case in the argument, at least in this case, in their opening statement. Now, also, he said that Lee, the brother, took after his father and also tried to touch Casey in inappropriate ways. He admitted to it. And in fact, they even did a paternity test to see whether Casey Anthony's child, Kaylee, was from the brother, Lee. So he's not going to deny any of this. Now, it wasn't, but that is another part that he brought out in his opening statement. So the search for Kaylee on June 16, 2018, what actually happened, according to the defense here, Jose Baez, is that was the day that Kaylee drowned. Now, if Kaylee drowned then, he said that actually George knew very well that Kaylee drowned then. And in fact, that morning, Casey, what happened was that Kaylee got out by herself. She was 3 years old. She always loved to go swimming. And she got out and went to the pool herself. And the ladder was still left up. And that's how she drowned. And June 16th, that is when Casey and George were looking for Kaylee in the morning. And George came out, according to Jose Baez, George came out holding Kaylee in his arms and began to cry. And he started screaming at Casey that your mother's never going to forgive you and you're going to go to jail for the rest of your life. But he says, why didn't George call 911? Now, again, this isn't his theory that this actually happened. So if it actually happened, it would be a good question. But again, the prosecution's going to say this is all a bunch of garbage. Never happened. But he said George didn't call 911. But Cindy is going to testify. According to Jose Baez's opening statement, Cindy is going to testify that on June 15, 2008, they did go swimming the day before the disappearance, or according to the prosecution, that Kaylee was murdered, June 16th. The day before, June 15th, they went swimming together. And they always made sure that when they were done swimming, it was an above-the-ground pool, so that you had to climb a ladder in order to get to the pool. They always made sure to take the ladder down so that Kaylee would not be able to access the pool. Because if there's no ladder there, then how is she supposed to get into the actual pool? Well, Cindy's going to testify that she doesn't remember if she left the ladder up the night of June 15th, which according to the defense, the next morning, if that ladder was still up, Kaylee could have gotten out, gone up the ladder, and drowned in the pool. And in fact, Kaylee loved to swim. Kaylee would even wake up George, her grandfather, Kaylee's grandfather, Casey's father, and say, Jojo, swim, meaning she wants to swim. So it's likely, or definitely possible, according to Jose Baez, that Kaylee actually drowned. Now, on June 17th, 2008, Cindy tells two coworkers that someone is swimming in her pool. Now, why is someone swimming in her pool? Well, because the ladder was left up. Now, law enforcement, according to Jose Baez, knew about this, but they didn't investigate it. So he made a lot of arguments in the opening statements about how law enforcement did not investigate this case very properly at all. This is a common theme that you always find with criminal defense, is that you always poke holes in the investigation and say how they were blindsided. They only wanted to focus on one person, whatever. So this is what one of the things that he did. He did pretty effectively. They were more concerned about the public because this is a very public case. So they were concerned about the public pressure on this case. Now, July 15th is when Kaylee was reported missing. Cindy actually tells them about the ladder incident, but there's no follow-up from the police. And then Jose Baez talks about how George, Casey's father, took certain steps to throw his daughter under the bus in order to protect himself. There was this gas can fight. There was a gas can that George used to keep in their shed. And at some point, Casey needed gas. So she went and broke into the shed and took the gas can. And there was some sort of gas can fight. Now, George reports the gas can missing on June 24th. Now, according to Jose Baez, this is very odd. Why would somebody call the police? And this is a former detective himself. George was a former law enforcement officer. And he goes and reports the gas can missing. Is that something that the police would care about, that your gas can went missing? Somebody stole your gas can? But he reports that the gas can is missing. And there's a reason, according to Jose Baez, why he wanted the police to focus on the gas can. So on July 17th, the detectives come to the house and ask to look around the backyard. We spoke about this in the opening statement from the prosecution. So July 17th, we're going ahead to July 17th. They look around the backyard, look around the shed. And at that point also, George, according to Jose Baez, would tell anyone who would listen that the car smelled like a dead body. Kept saying it. The car just stinks like a dead body. There's human remains in there. There's something to do with human remains. But he never said it around Casey. Never mentioned that around Casey. Now, he also told the FBI about the gas fight that he had with Casey 2 weeks later. And what do you know? The duct tape. Remember the very unique duct tape that only the Anthony house has. I mean, sure, other people have this as well, but it's a rare type of duct tape that the Anthony house has. That duct tape, there's a piece of it on the gas can. So the suggestion here that Jose Baez is making is that the reason why George was trying to get this gas can in the forefront of the detectives' minds was so that they will see the duct tape and then connect the dots to the duct tape, which eventually would be found on Kaylee's body. And the only place, isn't it a coincidence, according to Jose Baez, that the only place that the duct tape was found was on the gas can. Nowhere else in the house was they using duct tape. Now, on August 1st, George is at Publix passing out flyers about his missing daughter and missing granddaughter and asking for donations, and news crews actually interviewed him then. Right behind the donation jar, what do you know, is that same roll of duct tape. So not only did Casey have access to the duct tape, but George also had access to the duct tape. Then he started talking about Crystal Holloway. Who's Crystal Holloway? Well, Crystal Holloway at some point met George, and in Jose Baez's words, they had an affair. They started having an affair or a relationship or whatever they want to call it. And in fact, he showed a text message that George sent to Crystal that said the following: "Just thinking about you. I need you in my life." But George is going to deny that he had any sort of relationship with Crystal Holloway. But Crystal Holloway apparently, and again, I haven't seen this trial yet, so if you saw it, maybe you know this is going to happen. But Crystal Holloway is going to testify something different than George. And also, there's a security person. In order to get into Crystal Holloway's development, there's a security person who will tell you also, he's going to testify, or she's going to testify, that George came all the time. And at some point, according to Jose Baez, George is talking to Crystal, his girlfriend, whatever you want to call her. And he breaks down crying, and he tells Crystal how Kaylee died, that it was an accident that got out of control. So, some very interesting allegations that the defense is making here. And we'll see if all these witnesses testify to that. But this is what he's saying in opening statement that we can expect to hear. On January 22nd, 2009, George actually tries to harm himself in a very serious way. And fortunately, he was unsuccessful, and the police found him. And again, he says, we're not going to say and argue to you that George had anything to do with Kaylee's death because it was an accident. Then he talked about the discovery of the body. Now, who discovered the skull that we're hearing about in the woods that are right next to the Anthony home? It was a guy by the name of Mr. Kronk. Well, Mr. Kronk, according to Jose Baez, is a morally bankrupt individual, and he is actually the one who hid Kaylee's body. There was a reward. There was a $225,000 reward for a live Kaylee. If there's someone were to find Kaylee alive, they would have received $225,000. But according to Jose Baez, Mr. Kronk did not read the fine print that it was only if she was alive. He thought even if you find her when she's dead. Now, there's a very close wooded area to the Anthony home, and he said, according to Jose Baez, the first search should have and probably was done there. It's the most obvious place that you would search. The Anthony home, there's a missing child. The child was living at the home. Wouldn't you think to search the woods, which are right near the home? Well, actually, he said that the body was not actually, Kaylee's body was not found in the center of the woods. It was only 20 feet off the side of the road, which is most likely searched. 6 months of searching, thousands of people searching, and no one discovered it until December 11th. Does that make any sense? No, makes no sense, according to Jose Baez. Police were dispatched. They searched this area in September and November. The police claimed that they searched this area September, November. And then the body wasn't found until December by this Mr. Kronk. At some point, there was a claim that, the area was underwater, was not able to be searched, but it was really only underwater for 10 days. So no, it was not underwater. Now, Mr. Kronk, according to Jose Baez's opening statement, we didn't hear from him yet, but according to the opening statement, he was a meter reader. And on August 11th, one of his coworkers said that they saw everything going on he was a meter reader right near the Anthony home, and the coworkers saw everything going on. And they said, they should probably search the woods area. That's probably be a reasonable place to search. And Mr. Kronk goes to urinate in the wooded area, and he tells his coworkers, "Hey, I think I see a skull here." And they walk over and they see a dead snake. However, Mr. Kronk will testify that he was 99.99999% certain that he saw a skull August 11th. Now, the police come out officially August 11th and 12th, and they don't find anything. Now, somehow there's reports of a suspicious vinyl bag And then somehow the skull gets in the bag. So first he saw a skull outside on the grass where he's urinating. Then at some point, the skull gets into the bag. And he calls his son. Mr. Kronk has an estranged son who works in the Coast Guard. And he tells his son, I guess now maybe they're not estranged at this point, but he calls his son and he says that he found Kaylee's remains and that, watch, I'm going to be rich and famous. And this was a month before he found Kaylee's body. Officially finds Kaylee's body. So he made this phone call a month before December 11th. Now, at some point, his car breaks down, Mr. Kronk, and he gets a bill for over $1,000. And that was the day before he finds the body. So he needed the money. Now he decided, okay, now's the time to say that I found the body. And he had the body. So according to Jose Baez, he actually had the body. He had access to the remains for months. Now, the police never investigated Mr. Kronk. According to Jose Baez, the police didn't care about Mr. Kronk because they cared only about Casey Anthony. That's who they cared about. That was the person they arrested. That's the person that they had in custody. And this is who they want to stick this murder on. They never really investigated Mr. Kronk. Now, also, he claims, Mr. Kronk, at some police reports, that the skull we were just talking about rolled out of the bag when he hit it with his meter stick. But he says, according to Jose Baez, the police told him to keep quiet about the fact that he called them months before 3 times to report what happened. He saw a bag, or he saw a vinyl bag, he saw a skull. He was calling the police all the time, and the police were not responding, apparently. And they told Mr. Kronk, according to Jose Baez, that not to mention that fact, that he was calling them months before. At some point, he claims that they got Mr. Kronk to change his statement, that the skull didn't drop out of the bag. Okay. Then at some point, Kronk wants to be taken care of. He actually, look, I'm the hero here. I'm not getting any $225,000, but I got to be taken care of. So the Orange County Sheriff's Department, apparently Orange County, pays for a lawyer for Mr. Kronk. According to Jose Baez, this is all in the opening statement. And he gets on an interview with Good Morning America, and he gets $15,000 for a picture of a snake, according to Jose Baez. So continuing on, they even autopsy the snake, according to Jose Baez, which I guess we're going to see about. Now, here's an interesting thing. They never asked for Mr. Kronk's phone records. Well, Jose Baez says, we did ask for Mr. Kronk's phone records. We wanted to know where he was during this entire period of time when Kaylee was gone. But Mr. Kronk, his lawyer, filed a motion and objected. Well, actually, the motion was filed by Jose Baez's team, and it was objected to by Mr. Kronk. Well, why does he not want anyone to know where he was and his phone records? And we were the ones, again, Jose Baez is saying how the investigation was so lacking because they're the ones that actually found the son, the Coast Guard, Mr. Kronk's son, because the police didn't care to investigate Mr. Kronk. We were the ones who found his son, who told us that his father called him a month before and said that I'm going to be rich and famous because I found Kaylee's remains. So, I mean, I'm hearing all this in the opening statements I'm literally hitting the back of my chair. I'm just shocked that, to make these allegations is like unbelievable. And prosecutors didn't mention anything about this. And this is just wild, wild stuff. So there was a private investigator who's also searching the area. And he was working for George and Cindy at the time. George and Cindy hired this private investigator to try to help find Kaylee. And there's a psychic tip, actually, which was introduced to him by Cindy about the area by the woods area where Kaylee's body was eventually found. And Cindy actually said, I had people search that area and the body wasn't there. Now, let's talk about the hair. Now, there was a piece of hair that was found in the trunk. Remember that trunk, the Pontiac Sunfire? So there was a piece of hair from Kaylee that was found there. And the evidence, according to the prosecution, is going to be that there's some sort of expert who's able to tell whether a hair has indications of decomposition on it. And Jose Baez says that this type of analysis has never been admitted into court at all. The entire state of Florida. Also, dogs, remember the dog scent? Well, dogs can testify. And also, he's going to say that actually there was sometimes false positives where the dogs think there's something there. And in fact, the dog came back a different time and didn't make any sort of indication that there's human remains by Cindy and George's backyard. So the jury should discredit the dog information as well. All right. So he talks about how on June 16th, that is when the prosecution claims that Kaylee was murdered. June 16th, right? Well, in June 20th is when Casey runs out of gas. And that's when she breaks into the shed to get the gas can. Now, Tony Lazzaro, who is Casey's boyfriend at the time, he says was very cooperative with law enforcement. In fact, he said that we're not the ones that were able to manipulate Tony Lazzaro at all. And again, this is Anthony or Tony Lazzaro, Casey's boyfriend. We only were able to take his deposition. He is not working with us. So, you should believe what he's saying. This is not us putting up a witness. But Tony Lazzaro said that they were together. Casey actually asked Tony to bring her over to go together with this Pontiac on June 20th to go get this gas can. When officially, according to the prosecution, according to the state, she has Kaylee's body in the trunk. And they were in the car together. They got the gas can and they put it in the trunk of the car. So Casey got the gas, puts it in the trunk of the car. And if there's a dead body right next to the gas tank, would you think that she would not put that gas tank in the trunk of the car? She would keep it there in the front of the car. She wants to hide this death. And Tony is going to say that on June 20th, after 4 days of being an extremely hot temperature in a trunk in Florida, in the middle of June, you would think there'd be some serious decomposition there and serious smell problems. But according to Tony Lazzaro, he did not smell anything out of the ordinary from that car. So he said, where did that trash come from? Well, it's very simple. Tony Lazzaro is where Casey was living at the time. She was, even though she was with her parents for most of her life, but June 16th, around that time, she actually moved out of her parents' house and went to live with Tony Lazzaro. In Tony Lazzaro's apartment complex, you've got to take your trash out to the dumpsters. So you got to take your trash to the dumpsters. A lot of people drive with their trash to the dumpster. And that is exactly what actually really happened, according to Jose Baez. She put regular trash in her trunk of the car, and she just simply forgot it there. She's going to go throw it out, but she forgot it. And that's what happened. So the car is eventually towed on the 30th. Tow truck driver doesn't smell anything. So now you have June 30th, and the tow truck driver doesn't smell anything on June 30th. They wait 4 days because that's how long you have to wait. They send out the notice. George doesn't pick up the car until July 15th. So the car, according to Jose Baez, sat for a week after they had notice, and George didn't pick up the car. Now, when George says that he did smell this terrible smell when he actually did pick up the car, and he smells this dead body smell, this decomposition, what does he do as a former detective? Does he right away say, well, we should call the police and get someone involved, or what's going on with his human remains? No. He drives it home. Makes zero attempts to call Casey. Doesn't call Casey or anything. Doesn't call the police, which is very odd. So, also what's interesting is that George decided to bring the gas can to pick up the car. This gas tank that has the duct tape on it, that seems very important to George. He brings it with him to pick up the Pontiac. Now, how would he know that the car's out of gas? Why is that the reason that it was towed? Who says that that's the reason it was towed? Well, according to George, and again, this is what Jose Baez says, it was a lucky guess. So Cindy eventually goes to work, and the coworkers are the ones to tell Cindy that she has to go home. So as the story continues, according to the defense now, yes, Casey blames the babysitter who doesn't exist. And George doesn't say a word about the baby is missing in a call from Cindy. So when Cindy is finding out about this all, and she's saying, oh my gosh, the baby's missing. Well, Kaylee's missing. Does George say anything? George is quiet. Why, according to Jose Baez? Because he knows. He knows what happened on June 16th. one statement to the police, he actually says that he wasn't even there when Cindy called 911. So on the 911 call, you don't hear George at all, even though he was there, and you don't hear him flipping out. And in one statement, he says he wasn't even there. Now, also what's interesting is that Crystal Holloway, remember her, she was the person, according to Jose Baez, who George was having an affair with, gave him money to pretend that he was working, actually. Also, he's going to say about this hair. He came back to the hair. He said that the hair, they can't say, certainly came from a dead body, from decomposition. Remember, this is all new science. And also, there's, just in case the jury's wondering about how hair would end up in the trunk, well, there's 27 different types of hairs that were in the trunk. So hair somehow ends up in the trunk. You know, hair from people, the hair comes off of you and somehow it ends up in the trunk. You get them in the trunk, your hair falls off. And then he said that when they're talking about the hair, all of a sudden, after they took the deposition of these experts and realized that they have a problem with their studies, so they decided to do another study, or decide to do a study to try to confirm about their theory of this hair from Kaylee that showed signs of decomposition. Now we spoke about Dr. Voss, who Dr. Voss also, to talk about this scent, this aroma that he's going to talk about and use his expertise. He said also, this has never been admitted into any court of law in the entire United States. These type of science experiments that Dr. Voss is talking about. Also, he said that Dr. Voss himself is an inventor, and he stands to make millions of dollars on a machine that he's trying to sell, which he's going to use this trial to try to sell. So he definitely has some bias here to come off and help the prosecution. Also, he said that there's no fingerprints or DNA of Kaylee and Casey on the duct tape itself. And also, he said, one interesting thing that he mentioned is that George at one time lied to the police, and he was never charged with lying to police. Interesting how that works. And also, he said the medical examiner has no idea how she died. All the medical examiner knows is that it was a murder. But the medical examiner could not determine how exactly Kaylee died. And therefore, all these reasons together should equal reasonable doubt, according to Jose Baez. Okay, so then we had the first person who took the stand was George Anthony. So George Anthony on direct examination was very brief, very quick. And it seems like Jose is going to have a question whether he's going to recall George in his case, because it was very limited what he was allowed to ask questions about, because the prosecution was very limited in their questions. And anything that exceeds the scope of what the prosecution asks, well, then the defense is not allowed to ask that go into those areas. So George Anthony took the stand. She said that Casey always lived at home at Hope Spring Drive. She always lived, and all of a sudden, June 16th, she decides not to live there anymore. And that was the last time also, coincidentally, that he saw Kaylee. And he said that the morning started off very normal. He did hear a lot about Zainetta. I'm sorry if I'm saying her name wrong, or Zany. Maybe I should just call her now Zany. And he always had doubts about whether Casey was employed or not. Casey acted like she was employed, but he always doubted it. He did see that morning, June 16th, the last time that he saw Kaylee and Casey. They left that morning. They said goodbye. Kaylee said that she was going to see Zany, that was the nanny, but he never met Zany, never heard from Zany. And she left with the white Pontiac Sunfire. He was also asked about whether he ever did anything to Casey in terms of molestation or abuse. And he said, no, he never did anything like that. It's all a bunch of baloney. Everything that Jose Baez is saying about him abusing Casey, his daughter, when she was young. Never happened. And also he was asked, were you present when Kaylee died? All the stuff about Jose Baez saying that he was the one that was holding Kaylee's body after she drowned. So he was asked, were you there when Kaylee died? And he said, no, just heard about it today. What Jose Baez said. And he had nothing to do with disposing of Kaylee. He didn't place duct tape on her mouth. And didn't know that she died on June 6th. He according to him, this whole story by Jose Baez is one big false lie. Now, cross-examination got very interesting. It got very interesting because when he was trying to ask him questions about the wedding and about the pregnancy, about whether he knew that Casey was pregnant. And again, this is where it's very difficult to swallow this, because you're looking at this photograph, which is very obvious, a 7.5-month pregnant woman. You're looking at this photograph and everything in your brain is telling you that this is a pregnant woman. And he was claiming that he did not know that Casey was pregnant. And you can go watch the beginning of this cross-examination. You can tell that he is I'm talking about George, is very uncomfortable with this line of questioning. And again, it just seems like he's just not being so forthcoming. And all the body experts out there, I don't know if they did it yet, but they would probably have a field day with the first couple minutes of the cross-examination of Jose Baez, because George was very uncomfortable talking about that he did not know that Casey was actually pregnant at this wedding that he didn't officially attend, but saw a picture, and he claims that he was not aware that she was pregnant. Okay, well, he found out in May or June that Casey was pregnant. Now, this is also, again, a very interesting part. He finds out in May or June that Casey's pregnant, and she delivers in August. Okay, so this is going back a couple of years. So Casey's not married at the time, and she may have been seeing some different boyfriends, but a very natural question from the parent of a daughter who says that she's pregnant or breaks the news that I'm pregnant, who's the father, right? But apparently that didn't bother George. He didn't ask that question until much, much later, right before the delivery, and then sometime after the delivery, who the father of this child was. So just very odd stuff there. Something that we're not really getting the full picture of what really was going on there. So he had this idea, he had this feeling that Casey really wasn't working, even though she was pretending that she was working. She claimed that at that point that she was working for the Sports Authority. So he actually one day went to the Sports Authority to surprise her with lunch. Hey, I'm your dad. Let's go out for lunch. Now, apparently this seems to have been the first time that he was doing this. I don't know why this wasn't explored more on cross-examination, but this is like, hey, let me go surprise my daughter with lunch. How many times have you done that before? I'm not sure. But he decided to surprise her with lunch. And also he had a kind of a sneaky feeling that she wasn't really working there. So they spoke about that a little bit. And then he never went to Universal Studios to see whether she worked there when she claimed that she was working there. Now, something else that was brought out in cross-examination was the fact that actually George and Cindy were having some marital issues. They were having some marriage problems. And it was right around the time of when he said that he claimed that they were not having marital issues on that day of June 16, 2008. But he did say that when Kaylee was born, he had to move out of the house. So this is November 2005. And he said Lee also moved out of the house. But Lee moved out because he was just trying to gain his footing as a man and living on his own. And he said he was having financial difficulties at the time. He was having marital issues, and he had a gambling problem. But then he was asked about whether he told the FBI about being the subject of a Nigerian bank scam. And by the way, if you get these emails from the Nigerian bank looking to deposit millions of dollars into your account, so just be wary. It's not true. So he claimed that that's what he told the FBI, that he was a victim of the Nigerian bank scam, but he also had some gambling problems. And then eventually he moved back into the house, and that's when there was some tension between him and Casey. Now he remembers, that's something that also that Jose Baez brought out with cross-examinations, is that he remembers very clearly what Kaylee was wearing on June 16, 2008. And a point that Jose Baez was making with the cross-examination is that, do you know what Cindy was wearing? Your wife? For many years. Do you know what she was wearing? He had no idea. Do you know what she was wearing yesterday? 2 days ago? 3 days ago? Do you know? How come all of a sudden you know exactly June 16th, 2008, what she was wearing? And you were never asked that question until a month after June 16th, 2008. And you still remembered what Kaylee was wearing. Isn't that odd? All right. And he brought the fact that he met with the prosecutor about an hour before his testimony. And he also brought out the fact that within 24 hours of reporting Kaylee missing, all of a sudden he has a lawyer with him. George had a lawyer with him. Now, he claims that this was just a friend who's a lawyer, and actually he's a workers' comp lawyer. Nothing against workers' comp lawyers, but he said he wasn't a criminal defense attorney or anything like that. But eventually he did get a criminal defense attorney on the case. But while he was 24 hours after he reported it, he did seek some legal advice from him, even though he's never retained this friend of his who's a workers' comp lawyer. And okay, so he also said, wasn't it interesting that you would mention to the tow truck driver about your daughter and granddaughter? Why would you mention it to them about you being concerned about your daughter and granddaughter? You're going to pick up a car. So he said, well, when I started to smell into the car, that's when I mentioned something about my daughter and granddaughter being away. But again, that didn't cause him to call the police or anything, which again is a very odd part about this. Okay. So then we had Cameron Campana. Cameron Campana was the roommate of Casey's boyfriend. And I forgot his last name, but his name was Tony Lazara or something. Tony Lazara. Yeah. So Tony Lazara, he lived with Tony Lazara. He's his roommate. And that's when Casey moved in the middle of June. So they spoke about her living in the apartment and all the lies that she said, that she worked for the Universal Studios as an event coordinator. Really, she didn't do that. And she lied about stressing out about work sometimes. And also lied about the Batman premiere that was happening at Universal Studios that she was going to get everyone tickets for. So she lied about that. And never saw her get ready to work. Heard about the nanny a couple of times. The Zanny person. And sometimes she would vent to her mother, and she would walk out of the house when she would talk to her mother. And she never met George or Cindy. Never asked for help to find her daughter. He was never asked by Casey to help her find her daughter. And he did meet Lee Anthony later that night, July 15th, when they came to pick up clothing or other things. So this is where I want to show you the cross-examination. We got an hour into the video, and now I can show you what I thought was the most entertaining part of this day. And you have the cross-examination. So Ozevice is now going to give cross-examination on this roommate of Tony Lazaro. So let's listen to how this goes.
George. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Campana, is it? Campana. Were you in Casey's home on June 16, 2008 when Kaylee drowned?
No.
So the question was, were you in the home on June 16th when Kaylee drowned? Now, the question was objected to, and for some reason it was overruled. Now, it's a great question. It's a question that you expect to get objected to, and you expect the objection to be sustained. For some reason, this question was overruled. The objection was overruled. But that was the funniest part. That was the extent of his cross-examination. Were you present on June 16th in the Anthony home when Kaylee drowned? It's completely objectionable. The objection should have been sustained. I'm not sure why it wasn't, but that was his cross-examination. That's really what happened with the next witness as well. He asked the same question to the next witness, who's also a roommate of Tony Lazaro, and also basically testified to the same type of things that the first person, Cameron, what's his name is Cameron Campano, also testified to. So really not much more interesting things were going on with this next testimony. Just again, the same type of ideas. And okay, so that was really essentially what happened in the first day and parts of day 2 of the Casey Anthony trial. So we're going to be right back here to stream the day 2, the rest of day 2 and day 3 tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't miss it. We'll see you here. If you haven't yet, at this point, an hour into the video, you haven't yet subscribed, definitely hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, really helps out the channel a lot, and it's free, which is the best part. So hit that button before you leave, and we will see you all on the next video.